It's kind of crazy to think that as recently as 40 years ago, if you wanted to make beer in your home, you'd have to break the law. Thankfully, in 1978, it became legal on the federal level for people to homebrew, but unfortunately, this didn't include everyone, as certain states continued to restrict this natural right. But this all ended in 2013 when the last two holdouts, Mississippi and Alabama, passed laws making it okay for people to make beer at home. For the first time since Prohibition, it was legal to homebrew in all 50 of the United States. This was due in large part to the dedication and hard work of the American Homebrewers Association. In addition to continuing the fight for our right to brew, they're committed to growing the hobby by coordinating events such as Big Brew for National Homebrew Day and HomebrewCon. We're proud to say that the Brülosophy podcast is brought to you by the American Homebrewers Association and encourage all of our listeners to support the organization that has done so much for this hobby by becoming a member today. Considering the myriad styles of beer in the world, the defining factor for most can usually be boiled down to ingredients. Stout and porter rely on dark grains to get their characteristic roasty flavors, saisons fermented with yeast strains known to produce spicy and fruity compounds, and pale lagers often feature malts that impart bread-like tones. However, the never-ending love of hop bombs has led to the development of offshoot styles of India Pale Ale, where the differences seem to be defined more by process than ingredient. You're listening to the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and in this episode, Brülosophy contributor Brian Hall joins me to talk specifically about approaches to dry hopping hazy New England IPA.
Yeah, we're going to talk about several different ways that people dry hop New England IPAs, a little bit about how we dry hop regular IPAs, and then we're going to take a look at some biotransformation aspects of the New England IPA.
Yeah, well, and that's, it seems to me like for years and years, we're going to get more into this later on, but for years, dry hopping was one of those things you did at a very specific point in the process to contribute that aromatic, those hop aromas that are so pined for in this style of beer. And then along comes New England IPA and kind of throws that up in the air. And there's all of these theories out there about why we're doing that and good reasons for adding hops when you do. We've done a couple of experiments on it. Brian, you're kind of one of the people that I credit, and I've said this before, as making New England IPA a thing, at least in the homebrewing world. You're one of the first few guys that I knew of who was making this style. And, back way when, was it 4 or 5 years ago when you first started kind of dabbling in making these hazier styles of IPA, were you hopping things differently, or was it kind of an iterative process for you until you got to the point where you were, changing up your dry hop scheming?
Well, it kind of started with the idea of trying to layer hops. And this goes back to Ed Coffey and I having all these conversations of how we can get more and more hop flavor into these style of beers. And Ed would talk about doing 2 dry hop additions, and I thought that sounded interesting, so I started adding dry hops at the tail end of fermentation as well as right before kegging the beer. So just kind of trying to think of how can you get the idea of just being how much flavor can you get into a beer without having your IBUs off the wall.
Yeah, right. And that's, even nowadays, we're still seeing kind of this evolution of hop approach, when it comes to New England IPA. And, people adding, I was just reading something the other day, a home brewer who they did like a three different timed, whirlpool additions. So at different temperatures. And then they dry hopped at yeast pitch. They dry hopped at what we're calling a biotransformation. And then they dry hopped after fermentation was done, and then they dry hopped in the keg. All of these things to, reduce IBU as much as possible, that bitterness, while just maximizing hop aroma and flavor.
Yeah, just trying to stack in as many hops into the beer seems to be kind of the latest trend, which in my opinion is a lot more fun than the IBU battle or the low pH battle. So it's really exciting to see kind of where this is heading as people are trying to just go for flavor instead of potency of the beer.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm excited to talk with you about this again. You're kind of you're in my head. You remain one of the New England IPA experts and the originators. I know, man. God, kissing your ass here, but it's funny that you comment on it being more fun than the low pH battle, given the fact that you just killed it in the first round of the National Homebrew Competition with what did you took first and second place in both European sour ale, and American wild ale, right?
Yeah, those were 4 beers I was really excited for. But I should point out that those are not super low pH beers. I'm always a fan of subtle funk, subtle sourness, and so I had 4 very different beers that all fit different sour beer categories that I sent off. And yeah, woke up this morning actually to everybody chiming in with the good news.
Well, congratulations, man. I'm super stoked for you. Just a few months ago, we announced the formation of the Brew Club. I think this is pretty cool, which is kind of I think the idea behind it wasn't developed by us. It was developed by some Brülosophy fans who really jibe with the ethos that we kind of, put out there. But I got word, yesterday? I got word recently, at least, that we had a pretty good showing for the Brew Club in the National Homebrew Competition. I know that you entered your beers under the Brew Club, and I just want to give a shout out to all these folks that I heard did well. At the Indianapolis Judging Center, Richard Reed took first place in American Pale Ale, and Steve Baker took first place in the American IPA category, 2 categories that I know are really difficult to win because they're entered so heavily. At the New York City Judging Center, John Ackerman took second place in the fruit beer category, and in Portland, John Hosier took first place in both the Scottish and Irish Ale and American Pale Ale categories. Mike Fitzpatrick took third place in the Pale American Beer category, and Zachary Samarikov took third place in the Spiced Beer category. Finally, at the Tampa, Florida Judging Center, Norman Taylor took first place in the American Pale Ale category, while Will Cagle took second place in the American Wild Ale category and third place in the strong American Ale category. I mean, dude, we've got a lot of people. It sounds like an American Pale Ale, in American Wild Ale. You're going to be competing, against looks like Will. Man, this is exciting. I'm going to have fun at the award ceremony, cheering you guys on.
It's going to be a lot of fun. There's just so much great energy in that room, and I'm rooting for everybody except that gentleman who entered his Wild Ale.
Yeah, that's Will Cagle.
Yeah, Will.
We'll have to seek him out. Yeah, but if you're interested in joining the Brew Club, whether it's just for competition or if you need a secondary club for the community, whatever works for you, you can learn more about it at thebrewclub.com. That's the BRU Club.com. It's totally free, and it's a really neat community. The guys seem to be having a lot of fun over there. For those who are going to be attending HomebrewCon in Portland, Oregon from June 28th through the 30th, we still have some open spots for our Brülosophy karaoke party. It's going to be so much fun. I promise you won't regret going, and I guarantee you, just because you come to a karaoke party, you're not going to have to sing or anything like that. We're going to be doing the party on Thursday night. That's June 28th from 9 p.m. to 1 a.m. It is during the AHA's kickoff party, but you have about an hour there before you have to head over to sing songs and dance with a bunch of dorks like us. We'd love to get anyone who's interested on the guest list ahead of time. All you have to do is email me, marshall@brülosophy.com, and I'll get you details on how you can make a donation to secure your spot. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then at the end of April, Brian, you and I are going to be heading up to Yakima, Washington again to hang out with our friends from Yakima Valley Hops, as well as to attend the 16th annual Fresh Hop Ale Festival, which is happening on September 29th. I don't know about you, dude, but I am so excited about this, and I'm a little bummed we missed it last year. Looks like a rad festival.
Yeah, it looks like a lot of fun. And I mean, just judging from the awesome time we had last year and to know that there's going to be a party in addition to that, I'm so excited.
No joke. Something else I'm really stoked for is to check out. I don't know if you've been following Varietal Brewing Company on Instagram and social media, but they're one of the newest breweries up in Yakima, and they just had their soft opening. I'm going to put a bet on Varietal making a name for itself very quickly. We've had, we got to hang out with Chris, who's one of the brewers there. And I believe he brewed for Bellbreaker for a while. He's the one who gave us our tour last year. I'm super stoked. I'm sure we're going to be hanging out at Varietal for a bit. My guess is, being in hop country, they're going to have some pretty phenomenal IPAs on tap.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to that. I'm excited to see how they've changed that facility into an awesome place.
Yeah, no joke. The pictures make it look gorgeous. So,
oh, yeah.
Yep, that's going to be end of September. We're going to be hanging out up in Yakima. If you're around, hit us up. Let us know. We'd love to hang out with you as well. Thanks to everyone who's been using our links to do their online shopping. We appreciate the hell out of it. If you like what we're doing and you want to help us to keep doing it, head over to brülosophy.com/support to find a list of links to bookmark and use whenever you do your shopping online. If you want to be rewarded for your support, you can become a patron of Brülosophy by pledging a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll receive things like access to the Brew Crew private forum, secret contributor recipes, unique discounts at Yakima Valley Hops, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A with a very special guest. So far, patrons have asked questions of Michael Tonsmeyer, John Palmer, and Gordon Strong. They've been really incredible 1-hour experiences. Coming up this month is blogger and New England IPA expert Scott Janish, who's also working on a new IPA-focused book, as well as opening Sapwood Cellars with the mad fermentationist Michael Tonsmeyer. To learn more about how you can get involved in all the fun and to learn more about all of the rewards we offer for your support, head over to patreon.com/Brülosophy. Finally, if you haven't already, please consider leaving us a review wherever it is you listen to your podcasts. The feedback is very much appreciated, and your rating apparently helps those who might not already know about the Brülosophy podcast to more easily find us. All right, we've got some feedback, which this week is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in tri-clover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique and hard-to-find items for both the home and craft brewing markets, including high-quality stainless fittings at competitive prices and very fast shipping. They're really excited to announce the release of the BCS 482 control system. With 8 temperature inputs, 8 discrete inputs, and 16 discrete outputs, the BCS 482 provides everything needed to fully automate your brewery. Learn more about this and the other great gear they offer at brewershardware.com. And don't forget to mention Brülosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. Okay, so this week's feedback is a little bit long. It comes from one person, Colin Stacy from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and it's in regards to episode 35 on fining with gelatin. Sometimes we get feedback that is it's amazing to me that people invest so much thought into the stuff that we're doing, and this one I feel like I couldn't pass it up. I wish I could have forwarded it out to the homebrewing world because it was so interesting, particularly for those who like gelatin. So I'm just going to go ahead and read through it. I figured that episode was going to yield some interesting feedback anyways, but what Colin had to say was absolutely fascinating, and it was really long, so I've condensed it down for the sake of brevity. Colin is a process engineer whose work is in chemical plants, and he has particular interest in industrial wastewater, where he says a lot of what he's learned applies to gelatin and beer. He's been homebrewing for about 4 years and regularly uses gelatin to fine his beers. He starts off his email by dropping a bunch of interesting technical background on how gelatin works, mainly that it's a flocculant, meaning it attracts oppositely charged particulate in beer, which makes it dense enough to drop out of solution. However, it may also act as a coagulant, which actually changes the chemistry of the particulate, for example, by adding a charge to a particle that was once more neutral. You can see how this just tickled my fancy. Well, then Colin goes on to address the experiment we did on dosing rates, the one where a full packet of gelatin resulted in a beer with more haze than the one that was dosed with 5 times less gelatin. And he offers the following. This is all a quote here. There's an analogous flocculant dosing rate that's often discussed in wastewater. Dosing rate is going to be a function of 2 things: how active your flocculants or particles are, and how much particulate needs to be settled out. I believe you were getting at the latter in the podcast. If I have a hazy New England IPA that I want to clarify, I should be using more gelatin than I would for a much clearer beer, like a Pilsner with some good flocculating yeast. There's a lot to consider about relative activity of your flocculant and your particulate, which will affect your dosing rates, but that can get very complicated very quickly. In wastewater chemistry, we know that if we add too much flocculant, then the water has a hazy, slimy look to it. I attribute this to having too much unreacted polymer that was added to the water. Basically, the polymer will float around in the water until it finds sufficient particulates to interact with and sink. If you added too much polymer, then one of 2 things happen. Excess polymer remains in the water, which could give a texture closer to the polymer. Think of what it's like to make Jell-O, he says. Or the polymer may bind up together and remain floating in the water, causing some haze. In wastewater treatment, flocculant vendors like to specify a treat rate for their polymer and your solids. They'll run tests in a lab and say that you need something like 5 pounds of our polymer per dry ton of solids that you produce. There could be qualitative experiments on determining this ratio for gelatin in beer, but it would be very tedious to quantify. I think you and I have better things to do with our beer than run a quantitative analysis lab. It could get very complicated. In order to get a good quantitative understanding of required dosing rates, you need to know how much particulate you need to settle out and how active some particulate is compared to other kinds. Instead, people seem happy with their beer dosing gelatin the way they have been before we start an undergraduate chemistry project. Colin went on to provide equally as interesting information on the experiment looking at adding dry gelatin to beer, and that's something we might hit on later. But what he said about dosing rates supports what Jake was talking about in that gelatin episode and makes me want to repeat the experiment on gelatin finding in a New England IPA with a higher rate just to see if we might be able to actually drop a New England IPA clear and have it still taste the same as a, as the hazy version of that New England IPA. Brian, do you have any thoughts on this? I thought it was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, my scientist mind is kind of tingling now, thinking, all right, what if we took our New England IPA and maybe took 6 bottles and dosed them all with different amounts of gelatin and see which one drops out, and then toy around with that and apply it to a full size batch. Right. I mean, what he said makes sense. If you've got more stuff floating around, you're going to have more stuff to get rid of it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it on like a practical level, it makes a lot of sense to me. And I know a lot of people kind of, it ruffles their feathers to hear people talking about clearing up a hazy IPA. But for me, if the haze is truly a component of the process and needs to be there for that beer to taste good, then by all means, I'm not going to diss it. But if you can make a clear New England IPA and still have it taste different than, say, a standard, West Coast IPA or whatever, and it can be clear, I think to me, that's really neat. So I'm definitely interested. Well, thanks for the feedback, Colin. If anyone has any suggestions or ideas for what you'd like us to focus on, or if you have feedback for the show, feel free to let us know by emailing them to feedback@brülosophy.com, or you can leave us a message by phoning 951-444-0320. Again, that's 951-444-0320. So as someone who loves and brews his own beer, it seems like a lot of people presume that means that I've got some crazy obsession with big, hoppy, and nowadays very hazy, monstrous style IPAs and beers. So it really couldn't be farther from the truth for me. I certainly appreciate a good double IPA or imperial stout, but what makes me most excited is simple, clean lager. Traditionally, styles such as Pilsner and Vienna lager required fermentation temperatures a tad cooler than some breweries were capable of achieving. So they invented their own style that was fermented with lager yeast at warmer temperatures. Enter California Common, the most popular example of which it's got to be Anchor Steam, which is a favorite of mine. I love drinking that beer. Well, home brewer Jeremy Barr sent me a beer modeled after this style that he calls Steam Machine.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Pour some of my foam into yours.
I don't want your foam.
It looks like this is a 1 minute beer review with Tim, because all I've got is head on my beer.
Yeah, it's kind of plain.
Nope, you're wrong.
Probably.
You're wrong. My head is decreasing, so to speak. What does it taste like? What are the flavors? What are the colors? What does it sound like?
I'm not really getting much flavor.
You're baffled.
I am baffled.
I'm at an acceptable drinking level. I'm going to take over now.
Do it.
Smells like nothing.
It doesn't.
Tastes very clean. It's like Miller or Coors Light.
Yeah.
Daggone Coors Light.
It's definitely not Coors Light. It's something very easy. Doesn't have all the home brewing.
If you had to pick a morning that it was easy like
Sunday morning.
I knew you'd say that, dude. We're psychotic. It tastes like a light beer. I'm sure it's not a light beer. I'm sure it's complex with 17 flavors and 15 different hops, but it tastes like a light beer.
Yeah, I'm not.
There's not much to it, which is good. I kind of like it.
Yeah.
We have nailed down our style. Not complex.
I would totally drink it.
Yeah, I'd drink the shit out of this.
Hey, that's my line.
I'd be like, it's Miller Lite. And you'd be like, no, it's not. It's Coors Light.
It's not Bud Light.
Aren't we fancy? We don't know what it is.
I would drink it, though.
Coors, Miller, Bud.
Mixed together.
A suicide.
Well, I had zero doubts the guys would enjoy this beer. It poured a crystal clear golden color with a perfectly white cap of foam. It looked very familiar to them, I trust. And it tasted like a really well-made American-style Pilsner. For a Cal Common, it was a little bit too light for the style, but who cares? It really was delicious. Jeremy said that this beer was actually Brülosophy's fault for showing him that SAF Lager W3470 could be used to ferment a tasty lager at ale temperatures. Well, yet again, more evidence that it works. And I know there are still, unbelievers out there, and that's fine. I didn't detect a single flaw in this beer. No esters, no phenols, no acetaldehyde, no fusel alcohols, nothing that you'd expect from a warm fermented Pilsner, at least, conventionally thinking about it. It was just a great, clean lager that I'm assuming Jeremy called a steam beer out of respect for for whatever tradition it was. But good job, Jeremy. It was great. Brian, you a fan of steam beer at all? You drink it much?
I don't drink it a ton, but I am a huge fan of just clean American lager. I've just been crushing those lately.
Have you tried fermenting a clean American lager warm yet?
I've done styles where I've ramped them up after pitching cool. I haven't pitched one at 70 degrees myself, but I have pitched on the cooler side and then warmed it up very quickly.
Yeah, I just think 70 degrees is a little bit too warm. You got to stick at 68, man. That's
Right.
Well, if you have a beer or any other alcoholic beverage, whether you personally brewed it or not, that you want Jersey and Tim to review on the show, you can email me, Marshall, at brülosophy.com, and we'll get you all set up. We'll be back talking about dry hopping New England IPA after this short break.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to grainfather.com, that's grainfather.com, and get started today.
After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brülosophy sent you. Shopping for brewing supplies online can be a real hassle, which is why we recommend Love to Brew. They've got great prices, super fast shipping, and they carry exclusive products like East Coast Yeast, the Brewers Essentials brand, and their award-winning beer recipe kits. They're also the only place you can pick up your very own Brülosophy recipe kit. The numbers don't lie. Love to Brew has hundreds of 5-star reviews, and thousands of brewers are choosing them for their supplies and ingredients each year. Experience the difference at lovetobrew.com. That's love, the number 2, brew.com.
Dry hopping is a method used by brewers to impart large amounts of flavor and aroma into their beers without increasing the IBU of the beer, making it more bitter. Dry hopping is generally done towards the tail end of fermentation or after fermentation is completed, or at least that's what I've done in the past when I first started brewing traditional IPAs.
Yeah, likewise. It's kind of the same for me. When I brewed, I probably brewed a good 15 batches of beer before I even realized that dry hopping was a technique, but I got my start back in 2003. I think when brewers really started to kind of hone in on this idea of hoppy beer, and back then it was it was a bitterness race. It was who could make the most bitter beer, bitter piney beer. And I felt like more it was like proof of who you were as a drinker. Like, could you drink this bitter beer? And if so, you could brag about it, type of thing.
Yeah.
It wasn't until I think it was like 10 years in that I started to realize, man, West Coast IPA became a thing, and you started to hear this talk about reduced bitterness and more hop aroma and flavor, which is, like you said, it's commonly believed that that's primarily that's a dry hop thing.
Right. Yeah. When I started dry hopping, it was just kind of a step in the process. I hadn't really thought about, all the cause and effect that what was going on when I first started brewing. It was just kind of like, hey, I'm making beer. This is awesome. Yeah. So, I was like, all right, dump in the yeast, go to town. And then I was like, okay, now you need to add 2 ounces of your dry hops. It's like, all right, there we go. And, back in that day, it was all right, rack to secondary and all these sort of steps that weren't really thought about so much. But there's a lot more to dry hopping than I originally realized when I first started doing this step.
Yeah. And there's actually kind of an interesting, kind of a presumed history to dry hopping that I think is pretty cool. Like, my understanding is that it sort of came around as a kind of a technique to add flavor and aroma back to beer that had been sitting around for a while, perhaps on a boat on its way to a country called India.
Yeah, the idea that India Pale Ale was this overly hopped barrel of beer heading over to India to quench the workers over there. Some of that's a little fuzzy, but there have been some things that I've read that a beer would travel over there and then just to kind of like as you said, revitalize it. More hops would be added for additional flavor and aroma and and enjoyability.
Yeah,
so.
And we know it works. I mean, dry hopping is certainly one of those things that does add hop punch. I like to refer to it as. This is kind of an off question. Do we know why it's called dry hopping? I mean, we don't call anything wet hopping unless we're adding, I guess fresh hops like off the vine directly to wort.
I don't know. Maybe something, I don't know. I never really thought about it in dry wet sort of thing. Maybe because the boil just seems like maybe because as you're boiling, you're getting wet in the process. I don't know.
I'm dead serious. I looked into this. I spent a good half an hour looking into why it's called dry hopping. I couldn't find shit, man. There's nothing out there that I could find, at least. And I wasn't about ready to read through all the books I've already read once just to figure out why it's called dry hopping. But if I've read it, I don't remember. Anyways, there are some definitely traditional or more conventional approaches to dry hopping. For me, when I brewed that first IPA that I added, I brewed an IPA back in 2003 that didn't get any dry hops. There was no dry hop addition to it. And it was a bitter mess. I'll tell you that. So when I first started looking into IPA, which isn't a style that I brew too often, and not then, not now. But the idea was you want to wait till your beer is completely fermented out. Usually when you're racking to a secondary, a lot of us don't do that step anymore. And then that's when you would add, you would rack your fermented beer onto dry hops in a secondary and leave it on there for 10 days or whatever. And then, it's going to absorb all of those hop oils and whatnot and, produce a more aromatic, and hopefully flavorful IPA. Seems to me like there was this kind of shift maybe about a decade or so ago where brewers started realizing that, one, you don't need to rack to a secondary. And I think a lot of this came from kind of the professional brewing world. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, Brian, that by adding the dry hops when you've got a couple of points left, specific gravity points left fermentation, then you're giving the yeast, ample time to metabolize any oxygen that was, or to take care of, to scrub any oxygen that was came in when you added that dry hop charge.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two ideas there that you touched on, and one of those is when people were adding those dry hops after fermentation was complete. I think the idea behind that was they didn't want to have any of those flavors scrubbed out by the yeast during fermentation. I know I remember being in the camp of I see the airlock still bubbling. There's all my aroma. It's all leaving right now. And
right.
then I don't know whether that's true or not. I don't necessarily know, but I think eventually it kind of came to, these beers are still tasting good, and we have found that oxidation isn't a flavor that we love in beer. So they started adding these dry hops in towards the tail end of fermentation with the idea that any oxygen that may have been introduced during the dry hop process can still kind of get scrubbed by the yeast essentially.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. So that again, I for years, anytime I was making dry hopped pale ales. I think a lot of us got into the whole session IPA brewing thing a couple years ago, and that was the new thing. And I remember I think this was about 6 years ago now. I had a friend over, and probably second or third batch that he'd brewed with me, our first hoppy pale ale. It was borderline pale ale IPA that we're going to dry hop. So I had the recipe sitting out in my garage. We're brewing this beer. We called it Smiling Sky because, back when we used to name beers, things like that.
Aww.
I know, how sweet. But we brewed up this pale ale, and it was our first time brewing it. We designed the recipe together, kind of tweaked it. I believe it had like a big old charge of Simcoe, a couple points during the boil and then during the dry hop and all this. Anyways, we finished the boil, we chill the wort, and I run inside to take care of my kids. I heard some screaming, had to go make sure they were still alive. And so I'm inside for about 10 minutes. While I come back out, the wort had been racked to the fermenter. And the kettle's getting clean. Like, my buddy Chris, he's like cleaning things up. I was like, sweet. And I look over at my workbench and there's an open bag of hops that wasn't there before, that he had yet to close back up. And I look over at him and he's like, yeah, dude, I added the dry hops already, and pitched the yeast and it's in the firm chamber. And I was like, oh boy, I'll admit I got a little bit anxious. I'd never done this. But we figured we were going to ride with it and just see how it turned out. And fermented the beer out with the dry hops in there the entire time. Didn't add another charge or anything like that. And I'm telling you, that beer came out really, really good. It was as hoppy as you'd expect, from a regular old dry hopped beer. But it got me thinking anyways. I didn't go back and do that again. I'd kind of pushed it back to in the recesses of my mind until 3 or 4 years ago, when I started hearing about this newfangled hazy style of IPA that involved a slightly different method for dry hopping.
Sounds like you did what's called biotransformation.
Well, I'm not sure I'm the one who biotransformed, but
yeah. So biotransformation is kind of a catchy term for what goes on when you dry hop your beer immediately when pitching yeast or shortly after pitching your yeast. And biotransformation is when you have a chemical modification that is done by an organism on a chemical compound. In this case, we've got yeast that are working on the hop oils and the hydrocarbons that are inside of those, the hydrocarbons that are inside of those hop oils. So they are converting one compound. The classic one that people talk about is something like geraniol being converted to beta-citronal. So geraniol having more of a floral, rosy, geranium flavor to it, and it biotransforms into citronal, which is more of a citrusy, fruity compound, which is not something that you commonly see in hops.
Yeah. That's an amazing, I'm going to use the word discovery, but I know biotransformation is nothing new, but in the world of brewing and in particularly the use of hops in beer, it really is a fascinating topic because, and it's novel enough to where I don't consider myself an expert on it. I also don't brew that much New England IPA. But even as somebody who's brewed a ton of it, Brian, I know you and I've talked about, like, it's tough to find legit research on this because of how new it is.
Yeah, I mean, there are some studies out there, some of them as early as 2003. A lot of the information that I've found kind of comes back to this study where they're showing that, the same one that people describe all the time, that geraniol to beta-citronal. But yeah, it's a relatively new thing as far as being used widespread, and it sounds kind of, cool chemistry. So it's a hot term right now. This beer had this biotransformation phase going on with it.
Well, and it's also one of those things that makes this new style that is arguably controversial, I guess, because of the way it looks. Right. But it gives it kind of that unique spin. It gives it another thing. Like, this is what makes it special, and I don't say that pejoratively. It's what makes it unique as opposed to other types of IPA. One thing that I've heard about now, real quick, just to biotransformation. When we say that, when we refer to something as a biotransformation dry hop, all we're referring to is when the dry hop addition is added such that it is in the fermenting beer, so that the yeast is with it, and the biotransformation occurs as a function of the yeast's action on those hop terpenes, right?
Correct. And this is different than dry hopping at the tail end of fermentation.
Right.
The biotransformation phase happens at the beginning, through the middle, towards the end of, through the beginning and the middle of fermentation. It's not a tail end of fermentation thing. If you don't have those hops in there at the beginning, you're not going through that effect.
Now, one of the interesting things about this, and I think something that people who really, who are really looking to make that perfect New England IPA, you have to realize that certain yeast strains aren't genetically capable. I don't even know if that's the proper terminology, but they don't have what it takes basically to engage in this biotransformation process.
Right. So if we want to get a little technical for a second, so within the hop cone, we've got the hop oils, right? And those make up about 0.5% of the cone. And those are made of hydrocarbons, which are the terpenes that you're familiar with, and then what are called oxygenated hydrocarbons, and those are the terpenoids, and that's the things like the linalool, geraniol, citronol, and those are more soluble and aromatic. And then you've got a very small, about 1% of that are these small thiols, and we touched on that in the Citra experiment, talking about the cattiness that some people pick up, and in larger amounts, those thiols you can get kind of that cat pee that people were talking about. So those oxygenated hydrocarbons can be broken down through using certain yeast strains, and out of hundreds of yeast strains, maybe only a handful of these can actually transform these chemicals.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And as far as I'm aware, almost all of the yeast strains, at least that people are using to make New England IPA, almost all of the yeast strains are of English origin, and they're things like I kind of know, I speak Imperial's language nowadays because it's all I've been using, but it's like Juice, which I believe is similar to Y Yeast 1318. Their London Ale 3. It's Barbarian by Imperial, which is what Hetty Topper refers to as Conan, or not Hetty Topper, but The Alchemist. It's basically their house yeast. I've also heard things about the Whitbread Dry strain, which I believe is Imperial's house, and White Labs calls it their 007 English Dry or something like that. Those are like the main ones. The other one, a dry yeast strain that I'm aware of that people claim at least has the ability to biotransform is what is it? SO4, Safel SO4.
I honestly don't know which ones are the ones that are able to do this. It's essentially it's breaking apart these oxygenated hydrocarbons. I don't know which strains can do that, but I know some of those yeasts that you spoke of can just do the transformation. So there's two different things that happen during the biotransformation. You can have the transformation of one to the other, or you can have this breakdown of these hydrocarbons. And I don't know which one does which off the top of my head. Like we said, we're not experts, and this is all on the newer side for me.
Yeah, not just for you. I think in the brewing world in general. This is it's kind of a difficult thing to actually speak to with any amount of intelligence, because we really are, we're 4 steps on a path that's going to miles long, we will continue to looking into it. But I think it's fascinating. Another interesting thing. This is something, when I was over in New Zealand, Mike Tonsmeyer was there with us, Gordon Strong and I, and we got to a talk about a beer that he had that he was planning on kegging as soon as he got home. So this is, a long since gone beer, I'm sure. But he used what is it? Coriander in the beer because of coriander's high amount of, I'm not sure what is it? Geraniol, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And fermented it with, I'm almost certain he fermented it with that dry lager, or that dry Safel SO4 ale strain. And the whole point being to encourage this biotransformation, to convert that regular old geraniol flavor into this kind of citrus bomb,
Yeah, and I was reading online, and it eludes me at the moment which study or who did it, but there was another experiment where someone did something similar where they did that with coriander seeds, and they also did it with citra hops as well, which are both high in geraniol as well as linalool, and the coriander seeded beer did come back as being more citrusy, more fruity, but the citra beer that they brewed, definitely the study said that they did come back as much more enjoyable than the coriander beer. So yeah, there are things other than hops that can go through this biotransformation experience.
Right. Well, and there are other things in pretty much any And anything that you're going to add to your beer, it's not just pure, terpene or oil. It's, I have to believe that there was still some coriander flavor left in that beer that Mike made. And I'm not personally a big fan of that flavor in anything other than food.
No, me neither.
Yeah, I'm not a big wit beer fan or anything like that. So, but this whole thing about biotransformation, I think, is fascinating. It's new. We've gone over that. But practically speaking, again, just to reiterate, this is one of those things that people who are making New England IPAs are doing that they say contributes to that juicy characteristic. This is adding hops at yeast pitch all the way through high krausen, typically is when it is. And then there's some claims out there that it contributes to the hazy character, that it's one of those process components that is responsible for producing that appearance in New England IPA.
Yeah, there are some people that have tossed that around. I haven't seen any studies on that. I haven't read a whole lot on haven't seen a whole lot of information as to targeting that as being the haze producer, but it is a step in the process, and a lot of those other steps, I've played around with in my brewing, and the beers still come out hazy.
Well, we've done a couple experiments focused specifically on dry hopping New England IPA. That's what we'll be discussing as soon as we're back. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. When dumping wort-soaked grain and leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, do you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge, and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Founded in 1978 by brewing pioneer Charlie Papazian, the American Homebrewers Association is a division of the Brewers Association focused specifically on protecting and promoting the hobby of homebrewing. In addition to their work lobbying for the rights of homebrewers across the country, they're also the primary sponsor of Brülosophy.com. By joining the AHA, not only are you supporting their cause, but you get a ton of benefits as well. Discounts at breweries across the U.S., early access to tickets for events like the Great American Beer Festival, and you get to attend HomebrewCon, the world's biggest gathering of homebrewers. Head over to Brülosophy.com/AHA now to sign up to become a member. There are various things that make hazy IPA unique, in addition to the fact that it's actually hazy, one of which is the way in which they're dry hopped, as we've been discussing. And we've done some experiments to test this out. The first one, I was fascinated by this concept of the biotransformation dry hop that occurs when you add your dry hop charge at high krausen. About a year or so, 2 years ago, I started hearing about that as being a quintessential component to making a good New England IPA, that the dry hops had to go in when there was a big fluffy krausen on top of the beer. It didn't make much sense to me, and I hadn't really done much research into what biotransformation actually was. But I wanted to try it out. So after some deliberation with the crew, we decided the best approach to testing this variable out would be to brew 2 5-gallon batches separated by a couple of days. The sacrifices we make for this silly version of science that we do, man. This was not the funnest, because I had to brew twice in one weekend, which, but the reason we did this is because it would allow for each beer to be in contact with the dry hop charge for the same amount of time, right? So the biggest concern with doing this approach was that the standard dry hop batch, which was the one that I brewed first, would be in contact with yeast for a little bit longer than the biotransformation batch, but we had to figure something out. So, okay, so I brewed the standard dry hop batch on a Saturday morning, pitched the yeast, got that thing fermenting, and then I brewed the biotransformation beer on a Monday afternoon. So, a little more than 48 hours, probably like 60 hours or so, or 50 to 60 hours or so after I brewed the batch that would get the normal dry hop charge. I pitched the yeast and got that one fermenting. 40 hours after pitching the yeast into that second batch, I added dry hops to both. Okay, so it was at high Kreuzen. The biotransformation batch was at high Kreuzen. So I added the same exact amount of dry hops to that one as I did to the standard dry hop batch, which had been fermenting for almost 4 full days at that point. The Kreuzen had already dropped. So it was about the normal time I would add a dry hop charge. I let the beers ferment for another 4 days, at which point all activity appeared to be absent. And hydrometer measurements showed that the biotransformation beer finished about 1 point higher than the standard dry hop beer. So not a big difference. I just wondered maybe if there wasn't something converting in the beer, that it didn't contribute some sort of denser, to the beer. But 1 point really wasn't, I don't know. Does it concern you too much?
No, I mean, yeah, you're making 2 different batches on 2 different days. 1 point is not that much.
Yeah, and exactly. And I mean, the batches were made of the same. I mean, they were exactly the same with the exception of when I pitched the yeast and then when I added the dry hops. So, when the beers were done, I kegged them up, I carbonated them to the same level, and I noticed immediately when they were ready, before I even served them to participants, that there was already a difference in appearance. This, whenever I see a difference in appearance, and I'm sure this is the same for you, Brian, I'm already like, okay, this one's going to be significant, right? Because we don't let participants see the beers, but for some reason, I look at these things and I'm like, they are different. They're going to taste different if they look different. The standard dry hop beer not only cleared up more than the biotransformation beer, but unfortunately, it seemed to take on that purplish gray tint that many people are complaining about with this style. Made no sense to me.
Yeah, I personally haven't seen that tint in my beer, but maybe there's something behind the idea that by adding your hops while the beer is fermenting at some point, you are scrubbing out some of that oxygen. That
was my first impression.
That's my first thought.
Yeah, exactly. That by adding those hops later, I introduced more oxygen that didn't get scrubbed out, right? So, and at this point, I'm thinking, okay, that these are going to be different. I served the beers to 28 participants, which would require 15 to identify the unique sample in the triangle test for us to say it was significant. And in the end, only 11 people got it right. So they effectively couldn't tell these beers apart with any reliability. But even though, and I thought I was pretty fascinated by that, I took 8 triangle tests myself, and I found myself just randomly guessing most of the time, which is crazy because I'm drinking these things in clear glasses and I'm going, okay, they're obviously different. And I'd convinced myself that I tasted some differences there. As soon as they go into opaque glasses where you can't actually see the observable differences, the disparity becomes much less, they come a lot closer together.
Yeah. I mean, when you can't see the beer, and you're just relying on those sensory things, it's amazing. It's amazing what our eye, I guess what I'm trying to say is amazing what our eyes do as far as drinking. I mean, if you look at something that looks like a stout, in your mind, you're already thinking stout. So if I see something that has a hazier or, that kind of like that oxidized look, yeah, I'm going to be looking for that. I'm going to be thinking that I'm seeing it, even though I may or may not. So yeah, once you eliminate that visual component, maybe the beers were just simply that close.
Yeah. No, that's exactly. I mean, that seems like exactly what happened in this experiment. It was crazy. Well, even though we didn't reach significance, I still thought it kind of interesting to point out that for those people who did get the triangle test correct, preference between the biotransformation dry hopped beer and the standard dry hop beer was split right down the middle. 5 people said they preferred the biotransformation beer. 4 people said they preferred the standard dry hop beer, and 2 people admitted to perceiving no difference. They just, guessed right, which is what you'd expect from a triangle test that didn't reach significance. So,
yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. There's this actually is great because there was a study I was just reading about a couple weeks ago where somebody else did something very similar. They did a biotransformation experiment where they used a strain that had that enzyme that we were talking about earlier that can break down those glycosides, and the results that they found was that there really wasn't a whole lot of sensory difference between a beer that had gone through a biotransformation phase and some dry hopping that had gone through a biotransformation phase and some that hadn't. They did go on and say that they did some tests with fruit and they were seeing some huge differences. So I know you're really into those super hazy fruit milkshake IPAs, Marshall. You could try that out next time. But it's kind of nice to read somebody else that's doing something completely independent and it lines up with some of the work that we're doing. So
yeah. Dude, so speaking of fruit, so we recently had our live cast Q&A with Gordon Strong. He was down in Brazil, and he was telling this kind of anecdote about the Brazilians brewers down there, wanting to make these hazy New England IPAs that taste like fruit juice. And, they're consulting with Gordon and they're saying, but to get those hops, it's just so expensive. And Gordon basically says, what is it you're looking for out of those hops? Well, we want tropical fruit. We want this. And he goes, you can go down to the local market and get some of the best tropical fruit you've got, like in the world, right here in your backyard for cheap. Why don't you just go use tropical fruit if that's what you're looking to get in your beer and stop worrying about spending all this cash, on these expensive hops? Which is, I think that's good advice. If that's what you're looking for, you might as well go for it. After that, you talking about that research that you just did, I'm so curious if certain yeast strains, let's say they start doing that. Let's say somebody brews a beer with all of these tropical fruits in it, or whatever fruits, and they use something like, A38 juice from Imperial yeast to ferment it. Is that biotransformation going to make those tropical fruit flavors taste different as opposed to fermenting with something like Flagship, the Chico strain?
that would be so cool to try out. I would love to have access to that kind of fruit.
I know. Yeah, well, up in Anchorage, you guys have berries, I guess, right?
Yeah, we got berries and rhubarb all over the place. I can't say I've run those through the biotransformation. I mean, I love the fruit flavors that hops put out that I get, but I also like the supporting hop characteristics. I'm not a huge fan of fruiting my IPAs. I like my IPAs simple. I just want some hops and some base malt. Maybe a little oats if we're in the mood, but
I'm like that with beer in general. Just keep it simple, man. I like beer flavored beer. Well, speaking of New England IPA, Imperial Yeast has a few strains that work great for this style. We were just talking about A38 Juice, though they also have A04 Barbarian and A24 Dry Hop, which is a blend of two strains designed specifically to emphasize hop characteristics. A friend of mine just brought over an IPA he fermented with dry hop. It was fantastic, really unique. With each Imperial Pitchright pouch packed with 200 billion cells of the purest yeast, fermentation kicks off fast, finishes quickly, and results in the delicious beer you planned on. Imperial Yeast has strains for every style you can imagine. Check out everything they have to offer at imperialyeast.com. So we were talking about how this biotransformation dry hop thing basically means adding hops during active fermentation, having those dry hops in contact with the beer while it's actively fermenting. Well, our old contributor, Greg Foster, who unfortunately isn't brewing so much these days, he was curious after the biotransformation experiment we just discussed. He was curious to kind of put to the test this thing that I spoke of earlier that my buddy Chris did, which is adding the dry hops at yeast pitch. Can we get away with throwing all of our hops in at the beginning of fermentation so that we don't have to worry about adding hops later on, which could, introduce more oxygen than we want to our beer. So he brewed up a 10-gallon batch of New England IPA, split it between two carboys, and when he was pitching yeast, one of them received a dry hop charge, whereas that same amount of dry hops was placed in a baggie and flushed with CO2, awaiting being added to the second batch, which he did 4 days into fermentation. I loved this experiment because I was so curious just based on my previous experience with Chris. Is this anything you've ever done, Brian?
I haven't done it immediately when pitching yeast. I've done it very shortly after pitching yeast, but I can't see a reason why pitching it early would be good. The thing about if you are going to try and catch this biotransformation phase is you don't want to miss it.
Yeah.
And, sometimes, you don't get that you don't see as much action as is going on sometimes. So you do want to make sure that your hops are in there at the beginning. So, if this is something that you're trying to do, I see no problem with, trying to put it in right when you pitch.
Well, I think just thinking about it before we did this experiment, my biggest concern, like you mentioned before, was I don't want those oils, those flavor and aroma compounds to get blown off during fermentation when all of that CO2 is getting blown off, right? I mean, we hear things like, don't purge your keg once you've filled it with hoppy beer because you're going to blow off those aromatics. That makes no sense to me, and I think it's worthy of its own exploration experiment. And but still, that was my biggest concern. Is like, when my buddy Chris added those hops to the beer that we made, where this happened, I was just convinced there was going to be no dry hop character at least left in the beer, which couldn't have been further from the truth. So when Greg decided to put this one to the test in a kind of more formal experiment, I was pretty stoked. So what he did, the beers were finished. He added the dry hops to the second batch 4 days into fermentation, while the other one had them the entire time. So you could say that biotransformation beer was on the hops a little bit longer than the standard dry hop one. So, if this comes back significant, I'm thinking we have to at least consider that it just could be a contact time thing. He kegged up the beers, carbonated the beers to the same level. And then right off the bat, I was fascinated by this. Opposite to my observational findings, that the beer that received the standard dry hop charge, so the one that got dry hopped 4 days into fermentation, was characteristically more hazy than the beer that was dry hopped at yeast pitch.
Yeah, if you look at the pictures on the website, it's remarkable how clear the beer that's dry hopped at yeast pitch is.
Yeah, well, and to be fair, he did find these with gelatin, and we got a lot of shit for that, but that's okay. Regardless of the fact that he find them with gelatin, the one that was dry hopped normally, like you normally would, like a West Coast IPA, looked like a New England IPA as opposed to the super clear, biotrans one.
Right, and just to make it clear for the listeners out there, he fined both of these with gelatin. It wasn't that he fined one of them, and so the fact that they were both fine and one's clear and one's not, really, really surprising, because if we're thinking of this biotransformation phase as something that imparts haze, this particular experiment shows that kind of the opposite is true.
No kidding. It's fascinating to me. Well, and I guess it sort of suggests, at least on an appearance level, that the biotransformation dry hop thing may not necessarily be the culprit for the haze.
Right. And I kind of wonder, after, some of these experiments and the other study and the other thing that I mentioned, how, I'm really curious how much this biotransformation really does affect the final beer. Yeah,
me too. And we've only got these two experiments on the book so far.
I mean, it is an interesting step, and I think maybe it'd be interesting to keep testing these New England IPAs and kind of see how layering of flavors progresses a little more.
Yeah,
because
sure.
it adds more to a layering aspect rather than an actual transformation that we can taste.
Yeah, I have no idea. Well, to get to the results, he served these beers to 16 participants, triangle test. He would need 11 of those people to accurately identify the odd beer out in order to imply that it was a significant finding, and only 6 people chose the different beer, the unique sample, which is almost 1/3. It's just a bump over 1/3. Those beers tasted the same. And Greg said himself that the beers were identical in flavor, aroma, mouthfeel. He was absolutely unable to distinguish them in triangle tests that he took, even though he knew what the variable was.
That's cool. I mean, I don't know. It just always surprises me. I would have loved to have tried both these.
Oh my God, me too. And again, this is like I said in the last experiment. When beers look as different as these beers looked, it's so The experience that I have, everybody likes to think they're a good taster. I don't think we should shy away from admitting that we want to feel like we're better at this, or at least that we're really good at this thing that we love so much. If you see these two beers side by side and someone serves them to you and they're like, tell me the difference, you're going to come up with a whole bunch of differences that you're going to be absolutely convinced are true.
I mean, just looking at this picture, when I look at that beer on the left, I think crisp and clean. And when I look at that beer on the right, what goes through my head is, "Ooh, I bet that one's got a soft, pillowy mouthfeel," or something like that.
Juicy, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's the first thing that flops into my head. So, yeah, I mean, we do drink with our eyes to a point.
Oh, absolutely. And there's nothing wrong with that. One of the things that I appreciate so much about the triangle test is that we aren't asking people to pick it out based on appearance. And if that were the case, I think, you'd see a lot more significant findings and people feeling confident about what they perceived as being different between the beers. But so this one, again, supports this idea. It's in line with the findings from the first biotransformation dry hop experiment that it doesn't seem to impart, even when using a yeast that is said to have the ability to do this whole biotransformation thing, it doesn't really seem to have such an impact that people can actually perceive it, which is really curious to me because it seems like it's such a big part of making this type of beer.
Yeah, I mean, when you look up New England IPA, they say, low bitterness, biotransformation dry hop, and nice creamy mouthfeel are kind of the main characteristics. I mean, obviously there's more to each of those steps, but that's kind of considered one of the big marks of, did you make an IPA, New England IPA? Well, did you do a biotransformation dry hop? Did you add oats to it? All these and all these things that we've been testing and our evidence is coming back that, well, might want to take a second look at this. So I think with my wheels turning again, I think kind of stacking some of these might be kind of in order.
Oh yeah, for that is often what the conversation ends up going to is, well, if it's not just biotransformation alone, if it's not just flaked oats or flaked adjunct alone, if it's not just, a certain type of yeast strain alone, then maybe it's kind of the accumulation of these things all together, which makes total sense. I mean, that's not like a crazy idea. But it is fascinating to me that if this biotransformation thing is actually occurring and we're creating the conditions within which it's supposed to occur, yet people can't perceive a difference when they don't know what's going on. It just makes me wonder, something you mentioned earlier about, I think maybe you and I were talking about this before we were doing the show, but something about hop pellets maybe not being as susceptible to biotransformation as maybe whole cone hops.
No, well, we were talking about it was the pellets versus the fruit. So
that's right. That's right.
The study found that with the pellets there wasn't really a whole lot of sensory difference, but tests with fruit, they were seeing fruit with skin on, I should say, in case anybody's going to go out and try this, that they were seeing sensory differences when a biotransformation phase was happening.
Huh. I wonder. Well, I guess I wonder then if maybe whole cone hops would react differently to a biotransformation dry hop, than pellets, because they do go through a different process, and you've got people who swear that pellets impart a different character than whole cone.
Yeah, one way to find out.
Yeah, only one way to find out. Well, Brian, I'm curious if the results of these experiments have had any impact on your brewing and what you think about all this stuff.
I'm still adding my hops at High Kreuzen only because, and then this kind of comes full circle for a New England IPA. For me, I'm thinking flavor. I'm not thinking IBU. I'm not thinking, obviously not pH or anything like that, but it comes back to layering. And I'm just trying to add in as much hop flavor as I can without having it taste super green or earthy or any of those adjectives associated with overhopping. And so I've been playing around with adding hops at different times. I'm not convinced that, adding hops at different times is giving me any difference than just adding one giant keg hop beforehand. But, there's always more stuff to be tested. So, on an anecdotal level, I'm just still playing around with it. I still do a dry hop during high fermentation, but in my mind, I'm thinking I'm just adding some hops here. It's not so much of a, man, I really want to nab that biotransformation.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've realized that I'm not personally a huge fan of these hazier versions of IPA. That's just a personal preference. I don't care if people want to drink them. So I don't make them very often, but I will say that the in particular, Greg's, dry hops at yeast pitch experiment, I sort of forgot about those results until we were planning for this episode. And now I'm thinking, man, how cool to be able to add your dry hop charge when you're pitching yeast and not produce a beer that is any lower, at least, according to this experiment, in hop character in that hop aromatics, than if I come back and risk oxidation by adding the dry hop charge, 3-4 days into fermentation. So I'm certainly more, I guess I'm looking forward to the next dry hopped beer that I make, which probably won't be for a while. I do a lot of, Pilsners and whatnot, but just adding the whole entire dry hop charge at the very beginning of fermentation, and maybe it will contribute to the clarity that I personally find very appealing in these hoppy beers. I think it's kind of exciting to know that we can do that. I also, like for an experiment, I thought it would be cool. What if we did a beer that is like, all Whirlpool hops? So you either put all the hops in the Whirlpool, let it sit for however long, compared to, say, a beer that received all the same amount of hops, but at yeast pitch. Because we know that dry hopping does impart some bitterness. That's something that we're kind of learning about now. Maybe not in terms of isomerized alpha acids, but it's certainly adding some bitter characteristics. How different would those beers taste?
I think there's one way to find out, and I'm going to go get my mill. Fire it up right now. No, I think that'd be a great one. I know there's been, I think Scott Janisch did a test where he did all cold side hop additions, and the beer came back with a significant amount of IBUs after he sent it off to a lab.
Yeah.
I think
fascinating.
There's a lot to study, a lot to do. Good thing we got the right team for it.
Well, and this New England IPA thing, it's still a very novel, style of beer. We're still learning how to brew them properly and exploring all of its uniqueness in terms of process, as well as the way that process imparts these very particular characteristics is fun and really interesting. Well, if you want to read about the experiments that we discuss in this show or anything else that we've done, you can head over to brülosophy.com. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no